Hey, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods, the time of the Black Death and what it was like to survive this devastating plague. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Europe in the year 1347. The morning air is crisp as you open your eyes, stretching on your straw-filled mattress. You're not in a private bedroom like you might be used to. You're in a one-room cottage with the rest of your family. The walls are made of WL and daub. You know, a wooden frame filled with a mixture of mud, clay and straw. It's actually quite good at keeping out the cold, though the thatched roof overhead sometimes leaks when heavy rains come. As you rise, your nose fills with familiar scents, the smoky aroma from last night's hearth fire, the earthy smell of the dirt floor beneath your feet, and the distinct tang of unwashed bodies. Bathing isn't something people do very often in medieval times. The good news is nobody really notices because everyone smells pretty much the same. Your belly grumbles with hunger. If you're lucky, there might be some leftover bread from yesterday, though it's likely rock hard by now. You'd soften it in some ale. Yes, even children drink weak ale in these times. It's often safer than water, which can make you terribly sick if it's drawn from a contaminated source. Outside your small cottage, the village is already stirring to life. You hear the distant lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, and the calls of your neighbours as they begin their daily work. Most people here are peasants who work the land either as free tenants, who pay rent to the local lord, or as serfs who are bound to the land and must provide labour services. Life has a certain predictable rhythm in your medieval village. The days are measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the weeks by the toll of the church bells calling you to mass, and the years by the turning of the seasons and the cycle of planting and harvesting. It's a hard life certainly, but it's the only one you've ever known. What you don't know, what nobody in Europe knows yet, is that everything is about to change. A shadow is creeping across the continent, one that will transform society in ways no war or famine ever has. The first whispers reach your village on the lips of a travelling merchant. He brings exotic goods from far-off places, silks from the east, spices from distant lands. But this time he brings something else. Stories. Terrifying stories of a sickness that has been devastating cities along the trade routes. People are dying by the thousands, he says, struck down by a mysterious illness that brings fever, painful swellings, and almost certain death. Some villagers cross themselves and mutter prayers. Others dismiss the tales as exaggerations. After all, alarming rumours often spread faster than truth. The merchant moves on, and for a while, life continues as normal. But the rumours persist, growing more frequent and more frightening with each passing month. By autumn, the whispers have become shouts of alarm. The sickness has reached the Mediterranean ports of Europe, Messina, Marseille, Venice. They say ships have arrived in harbours filled with nothing but corpses, the sailors having died during their journey. God save us all, your mother murmurs when she hears the news, making the sign of the cross. In your village, people begin to prepare as best they can, though no one really knows what they're preparing for. Some store extra food. Others spend more time in church praying for divine protection. The local healer gathers herbs and remedies, though whether any will be effective against this unknown affliction, no one can say. The first cases reach your region in the cold months of winter. A neighbouring village just half a day's walk away reports several sudden deaths. The victims suffered high fevers, complained of terrible thirst, and developed strange black swellings in their armpits and groins. Few survived more than 3 days after showing symptoms. Your village elders meet to discuss what should be done. Some suggest closing the village to outsiders, while others argue that trade and communication must continue. In the end, life goes on, though with a new undercurrent of fear. Then one crisp morning, a young man who works at the mill fails to appear for his duties. When someone goes to check on him, they find him burning with fever, his body covered in sweat, his neck swollen with a painful boo the size of a hen's egg. The plague has arrived in your village. What follows is a time of horror unlike anything you could have imagined. The sickness spreads with frightening speed. One day a person is healthy, the next day feverish, and by the third day, more often than not, they are dead. The black buboes that give the disease its name, the Black Death, are painful beyond description. Some victims cough blood, suggesting the disease has reached their lungs, and these unfortunates rarely last more than a day or two. It's a punishment from God, some say, flogging themselves in penance for their sins. It's bad air, others claim, carrying posies of flowers to ward off the foul miasma they believe causes the disease. It's the Jews poisoning the wells, a few darkly mutter. Though your village has no Jewish residents, and such accusations make little sense, the truth which no one in the 14th century could possibly know is that the Black Death is caused by a bacterium called Yinia pestis. This tiny organism travels in the gut of fleas, which in turn hitch rides on the backs of rats. These rats, stowaways on ships and constant companions in medieval towns and villages, have unwittingly transported death across continents. When an infected flea bites a human, it regurgitates the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria then multiply rapidly, often causing swelling in the lymph nodes, those painful buboes. If the bacteria reach the lungs, they cause pneumonic plague, which can spread directly from person to person through coughing and breathing. But you don't know any of this. All you know is that people are dying and no one seems able to stop it. Your village, like thousands of others across Europe, is transformed by the plague. The church bells, which once rang to mark the hours and call people to prayer, now toll constantly for the dead. Eventually there are too many deaths to announce, and the bells fall silent. The dead are buried quickly with a little ceremony. Gone are the elaborate funeral rites that once marked a person's passing from this world to the next. Now bodies are collected on carts and taken to mass graves. Some families, devastated by multiple deaths, have no one left to bury their dead, and bodies might lie in homes for days until neighbours or parish officials remove them. Fear changes how people behave toward one another. Those who have healthy family members might bar their doors to visitors, while those with sick relatives often find themselves avoided. Some flee to the countryside, hoping distance will protect them from the disease. Others turn to religion with renewed fervour, processing through streets while flagellulating themselves to appease what they believe is divine wrath. The priests who should be a source of comfort are themselves dying in alarming numbers. Their duties require them to give last rites to the dying, exposing them constantly to the contagion. Many flee, abandoning their flocks in this time of greatest need. Those who stay often succumb to the disease themselves. Your family has so far been lucky. Though the plague rages around you, none of your immediate household has fallen ill. You've heard stories of entire families being wiped out in neighbouring villages, of children orphaned only to die themselves days later, of lovers separated by death just hours after pledging eternal devotion. But your luck cannot hold forever in a world where the Black Death kills 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. One morning your younger brother complains of feeling unwell. By midday he is burning with fever. By evening, the telltale swelling appears at his neck, and you know what it means. Your mother tends to him day and night, bathing his fevered brow with cool cloths, trying to get him to drink small sips of water or weak ale. Your father speaks of taking him to the monastery where monks treat the sick. But everyone knows the monasteries are overwhelmed with many of the brothers themselves victims of the plague. For 3 days, your brother's condition worsens. The boo grows larger, turning an angry red, then black. His breathing becomes laboured, and he cries out in pain and delirium. You take turns sitting with him, though fear makes you want to keep your distance. On the 4th day, something unexpected happens. While most plague victims worsen and die at this stage, your brother's fever breaks. He is weak, terribly weak, but alert. The boo remains, but it has softened somewhat, and over the next few days it ruptures and drains. A disgusting but hopeful sign. Against all odds, your brother is one of the few who will survive the Black Death. What you cannot know is why he survived when so many others died. Modern science would later discover that certain individuals carry a genetic mutation called Delta 32 that provides some protection against the plague bacterium. This mutation affects a protein called CCR5 on the surface of white blood cells, making it harder for the bacteria to enter and hijack immune cells. Your brother may well carry this mutation, as might others in your family. This genetic quirk, a random accident of nature, would give certain families and individuals a fighting chance against the deadliest pandemic in human history. And strangely enough, centuries later, scientists would discover that this same mutation also provides protection against another deadly disease, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Black Death, in selecting for survivors with this genetic trait, would inadvertently help protect some of their descendants from a disease that wouldn't exist for another 600 years. But that's a story for another time. For now, your family celebrates your brother's recovery as the miracle it seems to be. Not everyone is so fortunate. As weeks pass, the plague continues its deadly work. Your village, which once had perhaps 200 souls, is reduced to fewer than 100 fields lie untended as those who would work them are either dead, or too busy caring for the sick or burying the dead. The lord of the manor, who lives in a stone house on the hill overlooking the village, has lost his wife and 2 of his children. Even wealth and privilege offer no protection against the Black Death. Strangely, some people seem immune to the plague despite constant exposure. The village gravedigger, an unsavoury character who robs the dead before burying them, handles plague-riddled corpses daily, yet never shows any symptoms. A midwife who tends to the sick when she isn't delivering babies also remains healthy despite her dangerous work. Like your brother, they may carry genetic protection, though medieval people would attribute their survival to divine intervention or perhaps suspicious dealings with dark forces. Food becomes scarce as the harvest is neglected and trade dwindles. The price of basic goods sources while anything seen as a possible remedy, certain herbs, exotic treatments, religious relics becomes astronomically expensive if available at all. As winter approaches, the plague begins to recede, not because of any human intervention, but due to the natural cycle of the disease. Fleas are less active in cold weather, and rats tend to stay closer to their nests. For a brief time, there is hope that the worst has passed, but the Black Death is not finished. It retreats only to return with the warming weather of spring, finding new victims among those who survived the first wave. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive waves of plague will sweep across Europe, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, perhaps half of Europe's entire population. The world that emerges from this catastrophe will be fundamentally changed. The massive population decline will disrupt the feudal system, increase the value of labour and shift power dynamics between peasants and nobility. Religious authority will be questioned as people wonder why their prayers went unanswered and why so many priests abandoned their duties. Medical knowledge based largely on ancient texts and superstition will be challenged by the plague's defiance of traditional treatments. For those who survive, people like your brother, the gravedigger, the midwife, life will never return to what it was before. They are the fortunate ones, though they carry the burden of survival in a world of loss. They will rebuild societies, renegotiate their relationships with authority, and gradually construct a post-plague world that, for better or worse, sets Europe on a path toward modernity. But that is a story for tomorrow night. For now, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself as one of those medieval survivors, watching the first stars appear in the evening sky above your village. The plague has passed, at least for now. You have lived through humanity's darkest hour. And though you don't yet know it, you stand at the threshold of a new world born from the ashes of the old. The soft sound of your breathing mingles with the night sounds outside. A dog barking in the distance, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. Despite everything, despite unimaginable loss and suffering, life continues, and in that simple fact lies perhaps the most important lesson of the Black Death. Humanity's remarkable capacity to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to carry on. The morning after your brother's miraculous recovery brings a strange mix of emotions. Relief washes over you, certainly, but it's tinged with something unfamiliar. A sense of wondering why your family was spared when so many others weren't. This strange survivor's guilt, you know. This feeling of unworthiness amid widespread suffering haunts many who live through catastrophes. Your brother is weak but alert, his eyes clear for the first time in days. The drained boo at his neck has left an ugly scar that will mark him for life, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But a scar is infinitely preferable to a grave, and your family treats each day of his recovery as the gift it truly is. Why did I live when so many died? He asks one evening, his voice still raspy from illness. Your mother, lighting a rush candle as darkness falls, pauses before answering. Yo, God's will, she says simply, though her tone suggests she's not entirely convinced. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could possibly comprehend, is far more complex. Throughout human history, infectious diseases have acted as powerful forces of natural selection. Those with genetic advantages against specific pathogens survive at higher rates, passing these protective traits to future generations. The Black Death is perhaps the most dramatic example of this process in human history. Deep in your brother's cells, and perhaps yours as well, lies a genetic mutation that alters a protein called CCR5 on the surface of white blood cells. This mutation, known as Delta 32, creates a shortened version of the protein that makes it harder for the plague bacterium to enter and hijack immune cells. Some people have one copy of this mutation, providing partial protection. A fortunate few have two copies, giving them substantial resistance to the disease. It's a genetic lottery, and your brother happens to hold a winning ticket. But the cost of this evolutionary advantage is measured in millions of lives. Those without the protective mutation who succumb to the Black Death. As your brother regains his strength, venturing outside for the first time since his illness, you notice how dramatically the village has changed. Gardens once meticulously tended now grow wild. Houses stand empty, their owners dead or fled. The rhythmic sounds of daily work, the blacksmith's hammer, the weaver's loom, the miller's wheel are muted or absent entirely. Yet amid this desolation, signs of resilience emerge. A market day is organised, smaller than before, but vibrant with the energy of survivors determined to continue living. Farmers from outlying areas bring what produce they've managed to harvest. A travelling merchant, braver or more foolhardy than most, arrives with salt, spices, and news from distant places. The news is the same everywhere. Devastation followed by tentative recovery. No place has been spared, though some have suffered worse than others. Cities with their crowded conditions and poor sanitation have been particularly hard hit. Some small isolated villages high in the mountains or deep in forests have fared better, though few have escaped entirely. In your region, perhaps half the population has perished. In some places the toll is even higher. The merchant speaks of ghost towns where not a soul remains alive, of monasteries where every monk lies dead in his cell, of noble families wiped out entirely, their grand estates left without heirs. But he also tells of places where life continues with surprising normality, of communities pulling together to care for orphans and widows, of unexpected kindnesses in a time of overwhelming hardship. One story in particular captures your attention. In a village much like yours, a woman named Elizabeth lost her husband and 6 children to the plague within a single week. She dragged each of their bodies to a hillside behind their home and buried them herself, one by one. Yet somehow, despite this intimate contact with the disease, Elizabeth never became ill. Like your brother and the village gravedigger, she appeared to possess some natural immunity, that same genetic protection that modern science would one day identify. They say she's a witch, the merchant confides, lowering his voice, though there's no one nearby to overhear. How else could she touch the dead and live? Some wanted to drown her in the pond, but most were just grateful to have someone willing to bury their dead. Such rumours are common in these desperate times. Those who survive against the odds, particularly if they're women living alone, or people with unusual habits or appearances, often find themselves suspected of dark dealings. Fear and superstition flourish alongside the plague, sometimes claiming victims of their own. Your father, who has been listening to the merchant's tales, shakes his head. No witchcraft in survival, he says firmly. Some are simply stronger against the sickness, like my son. He places a proud hand on your brother's shoulder. The merchant nods agreeably, always careful not to contradict a potential customer. True enough, in every village there are those the plague cannot touch. God's chosen, perhaps. As winter arrives, bringing with it bitter cold and early darkness, your village settles into a new routine. There are fewer mouths to feed, which means food stores will last longer than usual. A small mercy, but there are also fewer hands to chop wood, repair homes, care for livestock, and perform the 100 daily tasks necessary for survival in medieval times. This scarcity of labour creates subtle but significant shifts in the relationship between peasants and the nobility. Your father, a skilled carpenter, is suddenly in high demand. The lord of the manor, who once would have simply commanded his service, now finds himself negotiating, offering better terms for urgent repairs to the manor house. He offered me a silver penny for 3 days' work, your father tells your mother one evening, his voice low with amazement, and a side of bacon. Such wages would have been unthinkable before the plague. But with half the craftsmen in the region dead, Those who survive find their skills valued as never before. Similar changes ripple through all levels of society. Farm labourers, once abundant and easily replaced, now command higher wages for their work. Household servants, especially those with experience running a large home, find themselves sought after by noble families whose staff have been decimated by disease. Women, too, find new opportunities in this reshuffled world. Widows who would once have remarried quickly now often choose to maintain their independence, running businesses left by dead husbands. Guild restrictions that once kept women from certain professions are informally relaxed out of necessity. A woman in a neighbouring village takes over her husband's blacksmith forge, scandalising traditionalists but providing an essential service no one else can offer. For serfs, peasants legally bound to the land they work, the plague creates unprecedented mobility. Many lords desperate to keep their fields productive offer freedom to serfs willing to stay and work. Others find they can simply leave, moving to towns or to other manors where conditions are better. With little fear of being forced back with so many dead, enforcement of such restrictions becomes increasingly difficult. Not all these changes happen immediately. Of course, the feudal system that has structured European society for centuries doesn't collapse overnight. But the seeds of transformation are planted in these early post-plague years, and they will grow in the decades to come. As for your family, you adjust to the new reality as best you can. Your brother regains his strength, though he tires more easily than before. Your father finds his carpentry skills in high demand, bringing home better pay than he's ever earned. Your mother takes in washing from the manor house, work that's now better compensated due to the shortage of willing hands. You yourself find opportunities that wouldn't have existed before. The parish priest, one of the few clergy who neither died nor fled during the worst of the plague, needs someone to help maintain church records. With a basic literacy unusual for a peasant child, taught by your mother who once served in a noble household, you're suited for the task. Spring arrives, and with it comes both hope and fear. The warming weather brings new life. Crops sprouting in fields, wild flowers dotting meadows, birds returning from their winter journeys. But it also brings the conditions that allow plague to spread once more. Sure enough, by early summer, new cases appear. This second wave is less devastating than the first. There are fewer people to infect, and many of those who remain may carry some genetic resistance. Still, each new death reopens barely healed communal wounds. One afternoon, while helping the priest update the parish death register, a grimly long document, you ask a question that's been troubling you. Father, why did God send the plague? The priest, an older man with a face mapped by lines of exhaustion, considers before answering. Some say it's punishment for sin, he says finally. Others believe it's a test of faith. The Pope himself has called for prayer and penance to end the scourge. He dips his quill in ink, adding another name to the register. But I've seen the most pious die in agony while notorious sinners live unscathed. I've prayed by the bedsides of innocent children as the plague took them. He sighed heavily. Perhaps it's not for us to understand God's plan. This crisis of faith is repeated in communities across Europe. The plague defies medieval religious understanding. If it's divine punishment, why does it strike the virtuous and sinful alike? If prayer and penance are the cure, why do devoted monasteries suffer some of the highest death rates? The authority of the Church, once nearly absolute in matters of earthly misfortune, begins to show cracks that will widen in the centuries to come. Medical knowledge faces similar challenges. Physicians trained in the most prestigious universities prove no more effective at treating plague than village healers. Their elaborate theories based on bodily humours and astronomical alignments fail to explain why some recover while others die. Why some communities suffer worse than others. Some doctors bravely attend the sick, often sacrificing their own lives in the process. Others flee at the first sign of outbreak, prioritising self-preservation over professional duty. Those who stay commonly wear distinctive protective clothing, long robes covered in wax, gloves, and a mask shaped like a bird's beak, filled with herbs and spices believed to purify the air. This strange outfit, which would become iconic in later plague outbreaks, does little to protect them from the actual source of infection. In the absence of effective official treatment, communities develop their own responses to the plague. Some are based on superstition, carrying talismans, reciting charms, avoiding black cats or people with red hair. Others have surprising practical value, isolating the sick, burning the belongings of plague victims, maintaining cleanliness. None offer complete protection, but these community-developed practices sometimes help limit the spread. Your village adopts several such measures. Houses where plague has struck are marked with white crosses on the doors. Visitors from outside the village must wait 3 days in a designated hut before entering to ensure they show no signs of disease. The dead are buried quickly. With minimal ceremony, their possessions burned. These precautions help, but they can't stop the plague entirely. By midsummer, your village has lost a dozen more people to the second wave. A serious blow to a community already diminished by the first outbreak. One victim is the lord of the manor himself, a man in his 50s who had survived the first wave only to succumb to the second. His death creates ripples of consequence throughout the local social hierarchy. His son, barely 20 and newly returned from university in Paris, inherits the manor and its lands. This new lord, young and influenced by novel ideas from his education, takes a different approach to managing the estate than his father did. Recognizing the scarcity of labour and the changing dynamics of power, he offers better terms to tenant farmers. Serfs who agree to stay and work, the mans are granted their freedom and more favourable rents. Those with specialised skills, your father among them, receive privileges once reserved for those of higher social rank. Not all nobles adapt so readily to the new reality. In neighbouring manors, some lords attempt to enforce old restrictions more harshly, forbidding peasants from leaving, punishing those who demand higher wages, using force to maintain the old order. These efforts rarely succeed for long. Peasants simply leave, seeking better conditions elsewhere. With land abundant and workers scarce, they find no shortage of opportunities. The plague's second wave finally recedes with the coming of autumn. Your village has survived, diminished but intact. Of the original 200 residents, perhaps 90 remain. Fields have been consolidated with the most fertile land prioritised for cultivation. Houses stand empty. Their timbers and thatch gradually scavenge for other uses. Yet life has a remarkable capacity to normalise even after catastrophe. Children play in the village square again. The rhythms of agricultural life, planting, tending, harvesting continue, adapted to the reduced workforce. Weddings take place, babies are born, commerce resumes. One clear autumn day. A surprising visitor arrives in the village. A mason who had left years before to seek work in the cities. He had built a good life in Florence, he tells anyone who will listen, working on the magnificent cathedral there. But when the plague struck, it devastated the city worse than any rural area. I watched half of Florence die, he says, his eyes haunted by memories. The rich fled to their country estates, but the poor had nowhere to go. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. I survived. God knows how. After the worst passed, work on the cathedral halted. With so many dead, priorities shifted to essential rebuilding. The mason, finding himself without steady employment, decided to return to his birthplace. His story is not unique. Throughout Europe, the plague causes a temporary reversal of the centuries-long trend of urbanisation. Cities with their crowded conditions are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many who survive flee to the countryside, seeking safety in open spaces and smaller communities. This urban exodus brings unexpected benefits to rural villages like yours. People return with new skills, new ideas, and new perspectives gained from their time in cities. They bring tales of different ways of living, of technological innovations, of political systems unlike the feudal structure of rural areas. The mason, for instance, describes how Florence was governed not by a hereditary noble, but by elected officials from the merchant class. He speaks of mechanical clocks that divide the day into precise hours, of water management systems that bring clean water into the city, of banking practices that allow trade across vast distances. These ideas find fertile ground in communities already questioning traditional authorities and practices. The plague has created cracks in the medieval worldview, and through these cracks new possibilities emerge. For you and your family, life continues in this altered landscape. Your brother, fully recovered, though scarred by his encounter with plague, apprentices to the returned mason, learning the skilled craft that will provide him a secure future in a world where such skills are increasingly valued. Your father's carpentry keeps the family comfortable, his services now commanding wages that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Your mother no longer takes in washing, instead focusing on an herb garden that produces remedies in high demand since the plague depleted the ranks of traditional healers. You continue assisting the priest with parish records, your literacy and quick mind making you valuable in a community where such skills are rare. In the old world, your peasant birth would have limited your prospects regardless of your abilities. In the post-plague world, with its fluid social boundaries and desperate need for talent wherever it can be found, opportunities expand before you. One evening, as your family sits around the hearth, sharing a meal more abundant than any you might have hoped for in the pre-play years, your father voices what many are thinking. "It's a terrible thing to say," he begins hesitantly. "But for those of us who survived, life is better now than before," your mother nods slowly. "More food, better pay, more freedom," she agrees, "built on countless graves. It's the uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the post-plague world. For those fortunate enough to survive, whether through genetic luck like your brother, circumstantial fortune, or simple isolation from infection sources, the new world offers advantages the old one never could. The massive reduction in population creates opportunities for social advancement, economic improvement, and personal freedom that would have been unthinkable in the crowded, rigidly hierarchical pre-plague society. Yet these benefits come at an unimaginable cost. The lives of millions, the destruction of families, communities torn apart, knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. No survivor can fully enjoy their improved circumstances without the shadow of this knowledge. As you drift towards sleep that night, you find yourself wondering about the future. The plague has retreated for now, but no one believes it's gone forever. It will return as it has before, bringing new waves of death. Yet humanity will survive, adapting to each outbreak, developing new responses, gradually building knowledge that will centuries later finally conquer this invisible enemy. What you cannot know is that you stand at a turning point in history. The world that will emerge from the ashes of the Black Death will be fundamentally different from what came before. The seeds of the Renaissance are being planted in these years of recovery. The rigid feudal system is beginning its long, slow decline. The unquestioned authority of traditional power structures, both secular and religious, has been shaken. And on a biological level, the plague has reshaped the human species itself, selecting for genetic traits that will influence health and disease resistance for generations to come. Your brother's survival, far from being merely personal good fortune, represents an evolutionary chapter in humanity's endless dance with the microscopic organisms that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as a new day dawn on your changed world, you'll continue the work of rebuilding, of adapting, of finding a way forward. That's what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry on bearing the weight of memory while facing toward the future, and in doing so, they reshape the world in ways that will echo through centuries to come. The story of survival we've been following through the Black Death of the 14th century is far from the only tale of courage and genetic luck in humanity's long dance with plague. As the soft darkness of sleep envelops you, let's journey forward through time to another village, another outbreak, and another remarkable story of sacrifice and survival. 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death swept through Europe. It's now the summer of 1665 and we find ourselves in Ersiam, a small village nestled in the picturesque hills of Derbyshire, England. Is pronounced just like 'em. It's a peaceful community of about 800 souls, mostly farmers and lead miners who work the rich veins running beneath the limestone landscape. Life here follows the familiar rhythms of rural England. The villagers rise with the sun, tend their fields and animals, work in the small local industries, attend services at the parish church of St. Lawrence, and gather at the local tavern to share news and companionship. It's a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else, where families have lived for generations, where the bonds of neighbourly care have been forged through shared joys and hardships. What the people of Am don't know is that they are about to face the greatest test, unimaginable before the plague. Your mother no longer takes in washing, instead focusing on an herb garden that produces remedies in high demand since the plague depleted the ranks of traditional healers. You continue assisting the priest with parish records, your literacy and quick mind making you valuable in a community where such skills are rare. In the old world, your peasant birth would have limited your prospects regardless of your abilities. In the post-plague world, with its fluid social boundaries and desperate need for talent wherever it can be found, opportunities expand before you. One evening, as your family sits around the hearth, Sharing a meal more abundant than any you might have hoped for in the pre-play years, your father voices what many are thinking. It's a terrible thing to say, he begins hesitantly. But for those of us who survived, life is better now than before, your mother nods slowly. More food, better pay, more freedom, she agrees, built on countless graves. It's the uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the post-plague world. For those fortunate enough to survive, whether through genetic luck like your brother, circumstantial fortune, or simple isolation from infection sources, the new world offers advantages the old one never could. The massive reduction in population creates opportunities for social advancement, economic improvement, and personal freedom that would have been unthinkable in the crowded, rigidly hierarchical pre-plague society. Yet these benefits come at an unimaginable cost. The lives of millions, the destruction of families, communities torn apart, knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. No survivor can fully enjoy their improved circumstances without the shadow of this knowledge. As you drift towards sleep that night, you find yourself wondering about the future. The plague has retreated for now, but no one believes it's gone forever. It will return as it has before, bringing new waves of death. Yet, humanity will survive, adapting to each outbreak, developing new responses, gradually building knowledge that will centuries later finally conquer this invisible enemy. What you cannot know is that you stand at a turning point in history. The world that will emerge from the ashes of the Black Death will be fundamentally different from what came before. The seeds of the Renaissance are being planted in these years of recovery. The rigid feudal system is beginning its long, slow decline. The unquestioned authority of traditional power structures, both secular and religious, has been shaken. And on a biological level, the plague has reshaped the human species itself, selecting for genetic traits that will influence health and disease resistance for generations to come. Your brother's survival, far from being merely personal good fortune, represents an evolutionary chapter in humanity's endless dance with the microscopic organisms that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as a new day dawn on your changed world, you'll continue the work of rebuilding, of adapting, of finding a way forward. That's what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry on bearing the weight of memory while facing toward the future, and in doing so they reshape the world in ways that will echo through centuries to come. The story of survival we've been following through the Black Death of the 14th century is far from the only tale of courage and genetic luck in humanity's long dance with plague. As the soft darkness of sleep envelops you, let's journey forward through time to another village, another outbreak, and another remarkable story of sacrifice and survival. 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death swept through Europe. It's now the summer of 1665, and we find ourselves in the Eyam, a small village nestled in the picturesque hills of Derbyshire, England. Eyam, you know, is pronounced just like 'em. It's a peaceful community of about 800 souls, mostly farmers and lead miners who work the rich veins running beneath the limestone landscape. Life here follows the familiar rhythms of rural England. The villagers rise with the sun, tend their fields and animals, work in the small local industries, attend services at the parish church of St. Lawrence, and gather at the local tavern to share news and companionship. It's a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else, where families have lived for generations, where the bonds of neighbourly care have been forged through shared joys and hardships. What the people of Eyam don't know is that they are about to face the greatest test imaginable, one that will write their village name into history and enshrine their collective sacrifice in legend. The plague has returned to England. In London, the disease that people still call the Black Death, though we now know it as bubonic plague, is cutting a deadly swath through the crowded streets of the capital. By the time it's finished, it will kill an estimated 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's population. This outbreak will become known as the Great Plague of London, the last major epidemic of bubonic plague in England. For now, the villagers of Eyam feel secure in their isolation. The plague is a city problem, they tell themselves, unlikely to reach their remote community nestled in the Derbyshire Hills, far from major trade routes and urban centres. But fate has other plans. In late August 1665, a package arrives in AAM, addressed to the local Tor Alexander Hadfield. It contains a bundle of cloth from London, Perhaps designs for the latest fashions or fabrics not available locally. Hadfield's assistant, George Vikers, who lodges with the tour and his family, unpacks the parcel. The cloth feels damp after its long journey, so Vikers hangs it by the fire to dry, unwittingly releasing the deadly cargo hidden within its folds, fleas, carrying the plague bacterium Yinia pestis. Within days, George Vikers falls ill with a raging fever. The telltale buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes, appear in his neck and armpits. The village watches in horror as this strong young man rapidly deteriorates. By September 7th, 1665, Vikers is dead. The first plague victim in AAM. Panic ripples through the community as more people sicken. By the end of September, 4 more residents of AAM have died, all from households near Vikers' lodgings. The plague has gained its first foothold. As autumn progresses, the situation worsens. More villages fall ill and the death rate climbs. Some families lose multiple members within days of each other. The gravediggers can barely keep pace with the mounting fatalities. The natural reaction in such circumstances is flight. In London, anyone who could afford to, including King Charles II and his court, had fled the plagued city for the safety of country retreats. The wealthy residents of M2 begin making preparations to leave, to seek refuge in uninfected areas until the danger passes. It's at this critical moment that 2 men step forward with an extraordinary proposition, one that will save countless lives beyond I am while condemning many within the village to almost certain death. William Messon, the recently appointed rector of I am, and his predecessor Thomas Stanley, put aside their religious differences. Messon represents the established Church of England, while Stanley follows the Puritan tradition to present a unified plan to the village. They propose that AM voluntarily quarantine itself. No one will leave, no one will enter, the plague will be contained within their boundaries, preventing its spread to neighbouring communities that would otherwise be at grave risk. It's a staggering request. In essence, the villagers are being asked to sacrifice themselves to accept that many more of them will die, to protect strangers in surrounding areas. Remarkably, they agree. The village boundary becomes a cordon sanitary, a line between life and death that no resident of Ayam will cross. Food and supplies are left at designated boundary stones by outsiders, particularly the Earl of Devonshire from nearby Chatsworth House, who promises to provide for the isolated villagers. Money to pay for these provisions is placed in vinegar-filled holes in the rocks, as it's believed vinegar will disinfect the coins. What follows is one of the most poignant and heroic episodes in the long history of humanity's battle with infectious disease. Summer turns to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring. Through it all, the plague continues its deadly work within the confines of AAM. Entire families are wiped out. Children are orphaned only to die themselves days later. Houses stand empty, their occupants buried hastily in gardens and fields, since the churchyard quickly becomes full. Within this tragedy, individual stories emerge that illuminate the extraordinary nature of human courage, suffering and survival. Elizabeth Hancock, a farmer's wife living at Riley Farm on the edge of the village, endures a loss almost beyond comprehension. In the space of just 8 days in August 1666, the plague claims her husband and 6 children. With no one to help her, neighbours fear approaching the infected household. Elizabeth single-handedly drags each body to a field near their home and buries them herself. The remarkable aspect of Elizabeth's story is not just her unimaginable fortitude in the face of such devastating personal loss. It's the fact that despite handling the plague-riddled bodies of her entire family, she never contracts the disease herself. Like the survivors we met in our earlier tale, Elizabeth likely carries the CCR5 delta 32 genetic mutation that offers protection against the plague bacterium. The Riley Graves, as they come to be known, stand to this day as a testament to one woman's suffering and endurance. Another extraordinary tale is that of Marshall Howe, Ham's unofficial gravedigger. As the death toll mounts, Howe takes on the grim task of burial, not out of noble sacrifice but for more mercenary reasons. He takes the opportunity to loot the homes of the dead before disposing of their bodies. Despite this unsavoury behaviour, Howe's story contains an element of medical mystery. He handles dozens, perhaps hundreds of infected corpses. He enters pleasure-ridden houses that others avoid at all costs. By all logic, he should be among the first to die. Yet Marshall Howe survives the entire outbreak without ever showing symptoms of the disease. Modern science again suggests a likely explanation. the protective genetic mutation that prevents the plague bacterium from gaining entry to his cells. What Howe attributes to luck or divine protection is actually the result of a tiny alteration in his DNA, one that gives him an edge in humanity's evolutionary battle against the microscopic enemy. Then there's the heartbreaking story of Emmett Seidel and Roland Tora, young lovers separated by the village quarantine. Emmett lives within AAM, while Roland is from a neighbouring village outside the cordon. As the quarantine takes effect, they find themselves suddenly and indefinitely separated. Unwilling to completely lose contact, they arrange to meet at a safe distance across Cucklet Dell, a natural ravine that marks part of the village boundary. There, standing far apart to avoid any risk of transmitting infection, they can at least see each other and exchange words of comfort and devotion. These brief, distant meetings sustain them through the early months of the quarantine. But as spring turns to summer in 1666 and the plague reaches its peak intensity in Am, Emmett stops coming to their meeting place. Roland continues to appear day after day, calling her name, receiving no answer. Only after the quarantine finally ends, Roland learned the truth. Emmett died in April, one of many young victims claimed by the plague. Their love story cut short by disease, but marked by faithful devotion remains one of IAM's most enduring legends. Perhaps strangest of all is the tale of Margaret Blackwell, who fell gravely ill with plague symptoms and was left for dead by her brother Francis. In her fevered state, Margaret staggered to the kitchen desperately thirsty, mistaking a container of bacon fat for milk. She drank deeply of the greasy liquid. To everyone's astonishment, Margaret recovered. For centuries, villagers would tell the story of how bacon fat cured the plague. The truth is likely more complex. Margaret probably carried the genetic resistance we've discussed, and would have recovered regardless of her unusual beverage choice. But the legend persisted, a reminder of how desperately people searched for any treatment that might save them from the plague's deadly grip. Through it all, the Ville's religious leaders provide what comfort they can. William Merson, who proposed the quarantine alongside Thomas Stanley, pays a terrible personal price for his courageous stand. His wife, Catherine, contracts the plague while helping care for sick villagers, and dies in her husband's arms in August 1666 at the height of the outbreak. Ezon describes himself afterward as a dying man, though he survives physically. In a letter to his children who had been sent away before the quarantine, he writes, "The condition of this place is very sad. I entreat you to fly this place. I am not in a condition to receive comfort from you. I am so weak I can write no more." Yet despite his grief, he continues to minister to his suffering congregation until the end. Church services move outdoors to Cucklet Dell, where fresh air is believed to reduce the risk of contagion. Villagers stand far apart from one another as they pray, an early form of what we now call social distancing. Even in the darkest hours when death seems to lurk in every shadow, the community maintains its spiritual practices, finding solace in familiar rituals, even as the world collapses around them. Not everyone behaves nobly. Of course, there are instances of looting, of neighbours refusing to help one another, of panic overriding compassion. One villager, Mary Cooper, attempts to break the quarantine, fleeing toward the safety of Sheffield before being caught and returned to IAM. But these lapses are exceptions. The overwhelming story of IAM is one of extraordinary collective sacrifice for the greater good. By the time the plague runs its course in November 1666, it has raged through AAM for 14 months. Of the approximately 800 villages present when the outbreak began, only about 340 remain alive. Entire family lines are extinguished. The Ville's social fabric is torn apart with gaps that will take generations to mend. Yet their sacrifice achieves its purpose. The plague remains contained within AAM's boundaries. Surrounding communities, which would almost certainly have been infected had the villagers fled, are spared the devastation. Thousands of lives are saved by the deliberate choice of a few hundred to face death rather than spread it. In the quiet aftermath, as the survivors begin the long process of rebuilding their shattered community, they cannot know the legacy they've created. They cannot imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story will still be told as an example of extraordinary communal courage and sacrifice. They cannot know that the plague that devastated their village was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England. That something about the particular strain of Yinia pestis that struck in the 1660s would make it less viable in later years, or that improvements in sanitation and housing would gradually reduce the rat populations that spread the disease. They cannot know that scientists of the future will take a deep interest in their descendants, discovering unusually high rates of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation among people whose family lines trace back to AIM survivors, stronger evidence of how infectious disease shapes human evolution through natural selection. And they certainly cannot know that their example will resonate with special poignancy in the early 21st century when a global pandemic once again forces communities worldwide to make difficult choices about isolation, quarantine, and collective sacrifice for the common good. All they know is that they have survived an ordeal almost beyond comprehension. They have watched neighbours, friends, and family die by the dozens. They have maintained their self-imposed isolation through summer heat and winter cold, through fear and grief and unimaginable loss. And now, as the plague finally releases its grip on their village, they must find a way to continue living. The survivors of AM face practical challenges immediately. Fields have gone untended, businesses have collapsed, housing lies in disrepair. With so many dead, traditional family structures have been shattered. Orphaned children need homes. Widows and widowers must decide whether to remarry. Property ownership becomes complicated when entire families have been wiped out. Yet, the human capacity for resilience, which we've seen throughout our plague stories, asserts itself once again. New families form from the fragments of those destroyed by disease. Distant relatives return to claim abandoned property and bring fresh life to the depleted village. Those with useful skills find themselves in high demand, able to command better compensation than before. The plague has acted as a terrible but effective form of natural selection. Those who survive, whether through genetic resistance, circumstantial luck, or some combination of factors, become the foundation for the village's rebirth. Their descendants will carry the genetic legacy of plague resistance. Though they won't understand this inheritance for centuries to come, for some survivors, the psychological scars never fully heal. Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her entire family with her own hands, eventually remarries and has more children, but villagers report that she is never quite the same. A distant look comes into her eyes at times, as though she's seen ghosts from that terrible week when death claimed everyone she loved. Marshall Howe, the unscrupulous gravedigger who survived against all odds, finds himself somewhat ostracised despite his apparent immunity. The villagers remember his looting of the dead, and while his services were necessary during the crisis, peace brings a reckoning with his behaviour. William Merson, broken by grief at the loss of his beloved wife, leaves AAM in 1669 to take up a position elsewhere. He eventually remarries and lives to the age of 71, but his letters reveal that he never forgets the horror of those plague months, or the sacrifice of his Catherine. As for the village itself, AIM gradually recovers its population, though some family names disappear forever from its records. The quarantine becomes part of local lore, a story passed down through generations with pride as well as sorrow. In the 19th century, as Victorian England develops a keen interest in noteworthy historical episodes, AM's story is rediscovered and popularised. The Plague Village, as it becomes known, begins to draw visitors curious about its tragic past. The Riley graves, the boundary stones, and other physical remnants of the quarantine become informal monuments. By the 21st century, AAM is a well-established stop on heritage tourism routes through Derbyshire. The village museum tells the story of the plague and quarantine. The parish church displays artefacts and commemorations. A Plague Sunday service has been held annually since 1866, marking the community's sacrifice. But AAM is not merely a historical curiosity. It remains a living community where descendants of plague survivors still make their homes. Some carry the same surnames as those who lived through the 166,566 outbreak. The Hancocks, the Siddles, the Blackwells, and some genetic testing has revealed still carry the CCR5 delta 32 mutation that may have saved their ancestors from the plague. The story of AIAM reminds us that history is not simply a collection of dates and events to be memorised. It's the lived experience of real people facing extraordinary circumstances, people whose choices, sacrifices and survival shape the world we inhabit today. As the soft darkness of sleep envelops you more deeply, carry with you the image of Am Village as it is today, peaceful, picturesque, with its stone cottages and flower gardens giving little hint of the tragedy that once unfolded there. Yet in the memorial plaques, in the preserved boundary stones, in the carefully tended Riley graves on the hillside, the past remains present. The villagers who chose to isolate themselves, knowing many would die as a result, could not have imagined how long their story would endure, or how meaningful it would remain to future generations. They acted out of immediate concern for their neighbours in surrounding communities, not for historical legacy. And perhaps that's what makes their sacrifice so powerful. It was made without expectation of recognition or reward, simply because it was the right thing to do. In a world that often seems to prioritise individual benefit over collective welfare, AAM stands as a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary selflessness when circumstances demand it. Tomorrow night, we'll explore how the world changed in the aftermath of these plague outbreaks, how societies rebuilt, how power structures shifted, and how the biological legacy of plague resistance continues to influence human health even in our modern age. But for now, let the courage of Ames villages accompany you into Dreams, a quiet testament to humanity's capacity for sacrifice, survival, and ultimately hope. Let's journey back now to the aftermath of the 14th century Black Death. While Am's story from the 1660s shows us the courage of a single village, the great pandemic of the 1300s transformed entire societies. As we drift deeper into this historical dreamscape, let's explore how surviving such catastrophe reshaped the medieval world. Imagine yourself once more in that small village we visited earlier, but now it's 1352. The initial waves of plague have finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape both physically and socially. As you walk through the village that was once home to 200 souls, you count perhaps 90 people remaining. Empty cottages stand like hollow-eyed skulls along the lane, their thatched roofs beginning to collapse without maintenance, their gardens overgrown with weeds. Yet amid this desolation, subtle signs of change are appearing, changes that will eventually alter the very foundations of medieval society. In the fields surrounding the village, the transformation is immediately visible. Before the plague, every available piece of land was cultivated, even marginal soils that yielded poor harvests. Generations of population growth had pushed farming onto less and less productive terrain, as people desperately tried to produce enough food for growing families. Now, with so many dead, land is suddenly abundant. Survivors abandon the least fertile fields entirely, focusing their labour on the best soils. This simple shift dramatically improves crop yields per person. Where once a peasant family might have struggled to produce enough to feed themselves after paying taxes and tithes, now they often harvest a surplus. For those who survived the apocalyptic mortality, food is more plentiful than it has been in living memory. After centuries of existing on the edge of hunger, this abundance feels miraculous, a small compensation for the emotional devastation of losing so many family members and neighbours. Changes in diet soon follow. Before the plague, most peasants subsisted primarily on grain. Bread, porridge and ale formed the bulk of their nutrition, with meat as a rare luxury. Now, with fewer mouths to feed and more land available, many convert fields to pasture for raising animals. Meat, cheese and butter appear more frequently on humble tables. The average height of the population, which had been declining due to poor nutrition, begins to increase again as diets improve. But the most profound changes come in the relationship between workers and landowners. The massive population loss, roughly half of Europe's people, creates an acute labour shortage. Fields still need ploughing, crops need harvesting, cloth needs weaving, buildings need repairs. Yet there are simply not enough hands to do all the necessary work. For surviving peasants and artisans, this new reality brings unprecedented leverage. Consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a ploughman in your village. Before the plague, he worked the fields 6 days a week, in exchange for a small plot of land to farm for himself and his family. If he complained or failed to provide the required labour service, dozens of other hungry peasants stood ready to take his place. Now, with half the village's workers dead, the local man steward approaches Thomas with an extraordinary offer. A larger plot of land, a reduction in labour service from 6 days to 3, and the freedom to work for wages on other manors if he wishes. The steward makes this offer not out of generosity but necessity. Without Thomas's skilled ploughing, fields will lie out, and everyone, including the lord of the manor, will suffer. Similar scenes play out across Europe. Peasants who for generations had been bound to the land as serfs suddenly find themselves with options. Many landlords offer freedom from serfdom as an incentive to keep workers on their estates. Others convert labour obligations to simple rent payments, allowing peasants to farm the land as they see fit as long as they pay the agreed amount. For skilled workers, the changes are even more dramatic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers all find their services in desperate demand. Wages for such workers double, triple, or even quadruple in the years immediately following the plague. A skilled carpenter who could once barely feed his family now builds a 2-room house with glass windows, wears better clothing, and eats meat 3 times a week. These changes alarm the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. They see the traditional social order crumbling as former serfs demand better treatment and common labourers live like minor gentry. Throughout Europe, authorities attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force workers back into their previous conditions. In England, the government issues the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws prohibit employers from offering higher wages than had been paid before the plague, forbid workers from leaving their homes to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and attempt to fix prices for food and other goods. Similar legislation appears across Europe. France enacts wage controls in 1351, as does the city-state of Florence. The Spanish Kingdom of Castile tries to prevent peasant mobility with its own labour laws, but these efforts largely fail. The labour shortage is simply too severe, the economic pressures too great, enforcement proves nearly impossible in rural areas, where local officials themselves, often dependent on good relations with the remaining workers, turn a blind eye to violations. Workers develop creative ways to circumvent wage controls. A carpenter prohibited from accepting more than a certain daily wage might receive gifts of food, clothing or housing in addition to his official pay. A farm labourer might work slowly or carelessly unless offered better terms than the law allows. For those enforcing the laws, the mathematics is unforgiving. Before the plague, a lord might have had 100 peasants working his land. Now he has 50 or fewer. Punishing one worker by imprisonment or fines only worsens his labour shortage. And if he treats his workers too harshly, they might simply leave, regardless of legal prohibitions against such mobility, knowing they'll find welcome employment elsewhere. The situation comes to a head in various peasant revolts across Europe. In 1358, the rural areas around Paris erupt in the Jacquerie Rebellion as peasants attack castles and noble estates. Though brutally suppressed, it demonstrates the new confidence of the labouring classes. In England, tensions simmer for decades until 1381, when they explode in the Peasants' Revolt. Led by Watt, Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John B., tens of thousands of commoners march on London demanding an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax and greater social equality. John B.'s famous sermon captures the revolutionary spirit of the moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asks rhetorically, questioning the very idea of aristocratic privilege. From the beginning, all men were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. Though the English revolt, like the Jacquerie, is eventually suppressed through a combination of false promises and brutal force, it represents a profound shift in consciousness. Peasants who once accepted their subordinate position as divinely ordained now openly question the social hierarchy. Workers who formerly had little choice but to accept whatever terms were offered now demand better treatment as their due. The economic and social transformations following the plague aren't limited to rural areas. Towns and cities experience their own profound changes. Urban centres had suffered particularly high mortality during the pandemic due to their crowded conditions. Florence, one of medieval Europe's largest cities, loses as much as 75% of its population. This devastating loss creates opportunities for survivors. Housing, previously scarce and expensive in successful cities, suddenly becomes abundant and affordable. Apprentices find themselves elevated to master status years earlier than normal, as guilds lose many of their senior members. Women traditionally excluded from many occupations enter trades left vacant by dead male relatives. Consider the story of Margareta, a weaver's widow in a small market town. Before the plague, she was permitted to help her husband in his workshop, but could not operate as an independent artisan. Guild regulations expressly forbade women from owning a weaving business. When her husband dies of plague, leaving Margareta with his tools, loom, and expertise she'd gained working alongside him, the depleted Weavers Guild faces a choice: enforce the prohibition against female members and lose a skilled practitioner, or adapt to the new reality. Faced with falling membership and rising demand for cloth, The Guild admits Margarita as a full member, one of dozens of similar compromises made across Europe as necessity trumps tradition. Though such opportunities for women would eventually contract as populations recovered for several generations after the plague, women enjoy expanded economic roles unimaginable before the pandemic. The plague's aftermath also witnesses changes in fashion, art, and architecture. The immense mortality creates a new consciousness of death's inevitability and life's fragility. The macabre emerges as an artistic theme: skeletal figures, death's heads, scenes of the dance of death, where skeletons lead people from all social classes to the grave. Yet alongside this morbid fascination comes a celebration of life and its pleasures. Survivors, perhaps conscious of how quickly existence can end, embrace luxury and beauty with renewed appreciation. Among those who can afford it, clothing becomes more elaborate and colourful. The drab, practical garments of earlier medieval periods give way to rich fabrics, bold designs, and status-signifying styles. The nobility, alarmed by commoners dressing above their station, attempt to enforce sumptuous laws dictating what each social class may wear. These edicts, like the wage controls, prove largely unenforceable. A prosperous artisan's wife might technically be prohibited from wearing silk, but if she can afford it, who in her community has both the authority and motivation to stop her? Religious attitudes undergo their own transformation. The Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faces a crisis of authority. Many priests and monks fled their posts during the plague, abandoning their flocks when spiritual comfort was most needed. Others stayed and died, leaving parishes without leadership. Monasteries with their communal living arrangements suffered particularly high mortality rates, wiping out centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. More fundamentally, the plague raises uncomfortable theological questions. If the disaster is divine punishment, as many church authorities claim, why do the virtuous and sinful die alike? Why do devout monks perish, while seemingly impious lay people survive? If prayer and penance are the remedies, why do outbreaks often hit monasteries hardest of all? No satisfactory answers emerge from traditional theology. Instead, two divergent religious trends develop. Some survivors embrace even more fervent piety, seeing their survival as evidence of divine favour that demands grateful devotion. Others adopt a more sceptical, questioning attitude toward religious authorities who fail to explain or mitigate the catastrophe. This questioning spirit, combined with the economic changes that give ordinary people more resources and leisure time, creates fertile ground for the intellectual flowering that will eventually become the Renaissance. When fewer hands must produce society's necessities, more minds can turn to art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, previously restricted mainly to clergy and nobility, gradually becomes available to a wider segment of society. Newly prosperous merchants and artisans want their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills useful for business as well as markers of rising social status. Small schools appear in towns and even larger villages, teaching practical knowledge alongside traditional religious instruction. The plague's demographic shock also accelerates technological innovation. With labour scarce and expensive, techniques that save human effort become increasingly valuable. Watermills long used for grinding grain are adapted for new purposes, powering bellows for blast furnaces, driving hammers for metalworking, fulling cloth, printing technology, which will eventually revolutionise the spread of knowledge through Europe, receives early impetus from the post-plague labour shortage. Handwritten manuscripts, each requiring months of a skilled scribe's time, become prohibitively expensive when have seemed absurd to earlier generations for whom rigid social boundaries appeared as natural and immovable as the stars. But as you fall asleep that night, the possibility settles in your mind not as an outlandish dream, but as a genuine opportunity. This perhaps is the most significant legacy of the Black Death. Not just the immediate changes in wages, working conditions and social structures, but the expansion of what ordinary people can imagine for themselves and their children. As dawn approaches and this part of our historical journey comes to a close, we leave you in this moment of possibility. Your world has been shattered by incomprehensible loss, then slowly rebuilt into something different than what came before. The medieval certainties that once governed life have been questioned, challenged, and in some cases overturned. What you cannot know as a survivor living through these changes is that you stand at a pivotal moment in Western history. The adaptations, innovations, and reconsiderations forced by the plague will eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and ultimately the emergence of the modern world. But that is a story for our final night together, when we'll explore how the long shadow of the Black Death extends across centuries, influencing art, science, medicine, and society in ways that continue to shape our world today. As our journey through the world of plague survivors nears its end, let's widen our view to see how the ripples from the Black Death continue to spread outward through time, shaping the world in ways both subtle and profound. The echoes of this medieval catastrophe still resonate today in our bodies, our societies, and our understanding of disease. Let's begin with perhaps the most remarkable legacy, the biological inheritance carried by descendants of plague survivors. Remember the CCR 5-delta-32 mutation we discussed? The genetic quirk that protected some medieval Europeans from the plague. This tiny variation in DNA didn't disappear when the plague retreated. It was passed down through generations, enriched in the European gene pool because those who carried it were more likely to survive and have children. Fast forward 600 years to the late 20th century. A new pandemic emerges, HIV/AIDS killing millions worldwide. Medical researchers racing to understand this new disease make a startling discovery. Some people appear naturally resistant to HIV infection despite repeated exposure. Further investigation reveals why many carry the CCR 5-delta-32 mutation, the same genetic variation that helped their ancestors survive the Black Death. The connection becomes clear when scientists understand how both diseases operate. Both the plague bacterium and HIV use the CCR5 protein as a gateway into human cells. The delta-32 mutation alters this protein, effectively barricading the door that these pathogens try to enter. A genetic adaptation selected by one deadly disease in the 14th century unexpectedly provides protection against an entirely different threat in the 20th. This discovery led to the development of new HIV drugs that block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking what the mutation does naturally. In a very real sense, medieval plague survivors have helped save lives in our modern age, their genetic legacy providing a crucial clue in fighting a disease they could never have imagined. But the biological impact of the plague extends beyond this single mutation. The Black Death acted as an intense force of natural selection, potentially influencing other aspects of the immune system in Europeans. Today's population descends disproportionately from the survivors, those whose bodies, for various genetic reasons, could better withstand the onslaught of Yersinia pestis. Some scientists theorize that certain autoimmune diseases more common in European populations, conditions where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, might be an unintended consequence of this selection. Our ancestors survived the plague because their immune responses were particularly vigorous. That same heightened reactivity, however, may predispose their descendants to conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system becomes overactive. These biological connections between past and present remind us that pandemics don't merely kill and then vanish from history. They reshape the genetic makeup of the surviving population, creating changes that persist for centuries or even millennia after the immediate crisis passes. The Black Death's social and economic transformation has proved equally long-lasting. Though the immediate aftermath, the labour shortages, wage increases, and social mobility we explored last night and eventually faded as Europe's population recovered, certain fundamental changes became permanent. Consider the institution of serfdom which had bound peasants to the land for generations before the plague. In Western Europe, this system never fully recovered from the disruption caused by the Black Death. Though landlords attempted to reimpose old restrictions, the demographic reality worked against them. Land remained relatively abundant and labour scarce for centuries, giving workers leverage that gradually eroded feudal obligations. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by various rental arrangements that allowed much greater personal freedom. Peasants still worked the land, but increasingly as tenants who paid rent rather than as serfs, bound by hereditary obligations of labour and subservience. Eastern Europe followed a different path. There, the nobility succeeded in reimposing and even strengthening serfdom after the plague, creating what historians call the second serfdom that would persist into the 19th century. This divergence between Western and Eastern European social systems, one moving toward greater freedom for common people, the other toward more rigid control, would profoundly influence these regions' subsequent development. The Black Death also accelerated fundamental changes in religious life. The Catholic Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faced challenges to its authority in the plague's aftermath. Questions about why prayers went unanswered, why religious processions failed to stop the disease, and why devout monks died alongside sinners created cracks in the edifice of unquestioning faith. These cracks would widen in later centuries. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, with its challenge to Catholic authority and emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, found fertile ground in a population already predisposed to question religious orthodoxy. While the Reformation had many causes, historians see echoes of plague-era disillusionment in the willingness of millions to break with centuries of tradition. Even art and literature were transformed by the Black Death experience. Medieval artwork often focused on religious themes depicting biblical stories, saints' lives, and divine figures. After the plague, new motifs appear. The dance of death showing skeletons leading people from all social classes to the grave. Reminders of mortality in still life paintings. A greater focus on the human experience rather than purely divine matters. This shift toward humanism, attention to human experience, emotion, and achievement would blossom in the Renaissance along with reclaimed classical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources. This human-centered perspective would fundamentally alter how Europeans understood themselves and their world. The plague's impact extended even to language. Our modern English vocabulary still carries echoes of the Black Death experience. We speak of quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quarantina giorni or 40 days, the length of time ships were required to remain isolated in Venetian harbours during plague outbreaks. We describe someone as having a deadline, originally a line drawn around a prison beyond which guards could shoot escaping prisoners, but similar to the boundaries drawn around quarantined plague areas. Even seemingly innocuous childhood rhymes may carry plague memories. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, has been interpreted by some as a reference to plague symptoms. The rosy rash, attempted remedies, sweet-smelling posies carried to ward off disease and outcome ashes from cremation falling down in death. Though scholars debate this interpretation, it suggests how deeply plague imagery may be embedded in cultural memory. The Black Death also transformed humanity's relationship with disease itself. Before the plague, illness was generally seen as either divine punishment or the result of imbalanced bodily humours with little concept of contagion as we understand it today. The plague's obvious pattern of spread, moving along trade routes passing from person to person in close contact, made it impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. Communities developed practical responses that, while not based on germ theory, which would not emerge until the 19th century, nonetheless incorporated effective public health measures. Ships were quarantined, infected households isolated, plague victims, and their belongings often burned. Cities appointed public health boards with extraordinary powers during outbreaks, establishing principles of epidemic management that would influence public health practices for centuries. These pragmatic approaches, developed through bitter experience rather than scientific understanding, saved countless lives in subsequent plague outbreaks. By the time the last major European plague epidemic struck Marseilles in 1720, authorities had learned to implement cordons, sanitaries, strict quarantines, and careful monitoring that successfully limited outbreak largely to that city and surrounding areas. Such measures came too late for the millions who perished in the initial pandemic, of course, but the knowledge gained from the Black Death experience helped to mitigate later outbreaks of plague and informed responses to other epidemic diseases. When cholera struck Europe in the 19th century, public health officials drew on plague management traditions to contain its spread imperfectly at first, but with increasing effectiveness as scientific understanding improved. The plague's legacy extends even to modern pandemic management. Many of the approaches employed during recent COVID-19 outbreaks, quarantines, travel restrictions, contact tracing, isolation of the infected have roots in methods developed centuries ago in response to the Black Death. Even the tension between economic impacts and public health measures echoes medieval debates about whether to close city gates and markets during plague outbreaks. Perhaps most profoundly, the the Black Death experience shaped how humans think about catastrophe itself. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where sudden disaster seemed ever-present. War, famine, smaller disease outbreaks regularly claimed lives, but the scale and speed of the plague surpassed anything in living memory or recorded history. This encounter with near-apocalyptic mortality forced a kind of collective psychological adjustment. Communities that survived learned they could endure previously unimaginable loss and still continue. Individuals discovered reserves of resilience they might never have known they possessed. Societies developed institutional memory and adaptive practices for future crisis. This capacity for resilience in the face of catastrophe remains one of humanity's most valuable assets. Throughout history, communities have faced disasters that seemed insurmountable, yet somehow life continues. People mourn their dead, rebuild their settlements, adapt their practices and move forward, carrying the memory of what was lost while creating something new from what remains. We see this pattern repeated after every major catastrophe. From the volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii to the earthquake that devastated Lisbon in 1755, from the 1918 influenza pandemic to more recent natural disasters and disease outbreaks. The Black Death, as perhaps the most extreme example of such calamity in recorded history, demonstrated the remarkable human capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately continue. This is not to minimise the suffering caused by such events. The plague brought pain beyond imagining, tore apart families and communities, ended millions of unique lives that each contained a universe of experience and potential. No silver lining of social change or biological adaptation can justify such loss. Yet understanding how humanity weathered this storm offers perspective on our own capacity to face present and future challenges. Climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruptions. Our world contains no shortage of existential threats. The history of the Black Death reminds us that previous generations faced their own seemingly insurmountable crises and found ways to continue. For the individual plague survivors whose stories we've followed these past nights, such grand historical patterns would have meant little compared to their immediate lived experience. Thomas the Ploughman negotiating better working conditions in the labour. Scarce aftermath wasn't thinking about the long-term decline of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock burying her family on the hillside above Aime couldn't have imagined her genetic legacy might protect descendants from a 20th century disease. Yet collectively, these individual experiences and adaptations created the sweeping changes that transformed medieval society into something new. This is how history often works, not through the conscious decisions of great leaders or dramatic turning points alone, but through the accumulated effects of millions of ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances as best they can. As we conclude our journey through the world of plague survivors, what lessons might we take from their experience? Perhaps the most fundamental is an appreciation for human resilience. The Black Death inflicted losses almost beyond comprehension. Half the population in many areas, entire families and villages wiped out, centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. Yet somehow survivors gathered the will to continue to rebuild, to create new families and communities from the fragments of what remained. We might also reflect on how catastrophe, for all its horror, sometimes creates possibility. The rigid social structures of medieval Europe, which had seemed as immutable as the turning of the seasons, proved vulnerable to disruption when the demographic realities changed. People previously confined to predetermined social roles found new opportunities in the aftermath. Though we would never wish for disaster as an agent of change, history shows that transformation often emerges from crisis. The plague story reminds us too of our biological connectedness, both to each other and to the countless microscopic organisms with which we share the planet. The Black Death bacterium Yinia pestis shaped human genetics, social structures, economic systems, and cultural expressions in ways that continue to influence our world today. Other microbes have played similarly influential roles throughout history. We exist in constant relationship with an invisible biological world that can both sustain and threaten us. Finally, perhaps the plague narrative offers perspective on our own mortality and vulnerability. Medieval people lived with death as a constant companion in ways most modern Westerners do not. The plague brought mortality into even sharper focus, inspiring artwork, literature, and philosophy that contemplated life's fragility and brevity. This awareness need not be morbid or depressing. Indeed, many who survived the plague embraced life with renewed appreciation, understanding firsthand how quickly and unexpectedly it could end. There's wisdom in this perspective, not a fearful obsession with death, but a clear-eyed recognition of life's preciousness precisely because it is limited and uncertain. As our story ends and sleep approaches, imagine once more that medieval village we first visited now a generation after the plague has passed. The population has begun to recover with new children playing in the streets and young families occupying cottages that stood empty for years. The survivors, now elders, carry the memory of what happened, both the horrors they witnessed and the changes they helped create in the aftermath. They could not know how their experience would echo through centuries, influencing everything from genetic inheritance to social structures, from artistic expression to approaches to public health. They simply lived their lives as best they could in circumstances they never chose, displaying that remarkable human capacity for adaptation and perseverance that has carried our species through countless challenges. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought to carry into dreams, that we, like those plague survivors, possess resources of resilience and adaptability we may not recognise until circumstances demand them. That life, for all its fragility, exhibits a persistent tendency to continue, to rebuild, to find new paths forward when old ones are blocked. The Black Death survivors could never have imagined our world with its medical technologies, instant global communication, and scientific understanding of the very bacterium that caused their suffering. Nor can we fully envision the world our descendants will inhabit generations hence. But like those medieval ancestors, we move forward, carrying both the wounds of past catastrophes and the insights gained from surviving them, contributing in ways both small and large to the unfolding human story. Sleep well, knowing you're part of this long continuum of human experience, connected to those who came before and those who will follow, each generation facing its own challenges, each finding its own ways to endure, adapt, and ultimately continue the remarkable journey of our species through time.